The jaw came first. Long before the madness, the miscarriages, or the funerals that paraded through palaces like clockwork, there was the jaw. It jutted out from portraits like a curse etched in bone lantern-shaped swollen, and so pronounced that some royals couldn't close their mouths. The lower lip drooped like melted wax, and behind it a lisping tongue fumbled the simplest Latin prayers. Courtiers whispered it behind fans, doctors scribbled it into their reports, and artists softened it with paint. But the deformity had already become myth, the Habsburg jaw. It was the face of a dynasty choking on its own lineage. This was not disease, it was design. From the 15th century onward, the Habsburgs didn't just rise, they multiplied into themselves. The rulers of Austria and Spain believed they were chosen by God to reign over vast empires, but divine right in their minds demanded divine blood, and divine blood could not be diluted. So they turned their backs on diplomacy and began marrying their own cousins, uncles, nieces. Their family tree didn't grow. It curled inward like a worm devouring itself. They used marriage not to expand, but to entrench. Not to ally, but to imprison. Power was the altar and purity the offering. The idea was simple: if the bloodline was sacred, no outsider should enter it. But blood doesn't care about thrones or theology. It breaks down under pressure. And after generations of these pure unions, the results began to fester. Children were stillborn or lived only hours. Surviving sons came twisted tongues too large to speak, jaws too slack to eat, heads misshapen like melted wax figurines. Royal babies were baptized in one breath and given last rites in the next, and still they married closer. Not because they didn't know, but because they did. The Habsburgs had been warned. Even as early as the 1500s, chroniclers noted that too many intermarriages were leading to weak offspring. But kings don't answer to doctors. They answer to legacy. And so the next match might be between a king and his cousin, or a king and his niece, or worse. In Spain, the royal court became a mausoleum with silk curtains. Portraits show eyes too wide, lips drooping in confusion. A little girl in a ruffled dress standing beside her uncle, soon to be her husband. A boy with the eyes of a child and the jaw of a corpse. In Vienna, the Austrian branch of the family mirrored the same strategy. And everywhere the same pattern emerged: the tighter the blood, the more broken the children. But the horror wasn't just physical, it was spiritual. These were not peasants, these were kings. God's chosen rulers. How could something sacred produce such visible decay? The answer was never to stop the inbreeding. It was to double down. Pray harder. Marry closer. Build another cathedral. And bury another baby. In the archives, you find letters from concerned ambassadors, foreign queens, appalled at the marriages they were forced to witness. One French envoy described the Spanish royal court as a theater of death dressed in brocade. A German noblewoman refused a marriage proposal from a Habsburg prince, writing, "I would rather die in a convent than bring forth monsters." She wasn't being cruel. She was being accurate. The most infamous of these marriages would come later: a child bride and her uncle king, their union meant to save a dying line. But even before them, the foundations were laid. Year after year, the family chose familiarity over function, godliness over genetics. They didn't marry for love. They didn't even marry for alliance. They married for resemblance. The goal was to replicate, not reproduce. At court, the joke was bitter. The Habsburgs do not marry, they clone. But no one was laughing when the heir was born disfigured, or when the queen miscarried for the 6th time, or when the priest was summoned again not to baptize but to bless the dead. By the 17th century, Europe had begun to notice. Other dynasties sent their daughters into convents before sending them into Spanish or Austrian palaces. The Habsburgs were respected, feared, but no longer envied. Their palaces were gilded tombs, their portraits ghastly memorials of what power can become when it turns inward. And yet the machine continued. The next royal bride was already being trained to walk slowly, to speak softly, to smile through sickness. She would marry her uncle soon. She would lie beside a man who held her as a baby and now held a crown. Her body would not belong to her. It would belong to the bloodline that devoured itself. What happens when the throne becomes a breeding cage, when a girl is not a daughter but an offering? We are only just beginning. He could barely walk by the time he was crowned. His feet shuffled uneven and awkward, as if his legs hadn't been built to carry the weight of a crown or a nation. His tongue, grotesquely oversized, lolled in his mouth, making speech a trial and eating nearly impossible. His eyes flickered with confusion, his expressions childlike even in adulthood. His name was Charles II of Spain, and he was the inevitable result of a family tree that had stopped branching out and started folding in. Charles II was not just the child of royal blood, he was its most extreme distillation. Both his mother and his father were Habsburgs. His mother Mariana of Austria was the niece of his father Philip IV. That made Philip both his father and his great-uncle. And Mariana, she was a woman trained from infancy to be a wife to her uncle king. Her reward for obedience was the impossible burden of giving Spain an heir. What she produced instead was a boy who would become Europe's most tragic monarch. The early years of Charles's life were hidden in heavy curtains of silence and denial. The court spoke in half-truths. They blamed his sluggish development on piety. His inability to speak was thoughtfulness. His skeletal deformities were God's design. But the truth leaked out in the margins. He was a broken child. He could not chew food. He could not stand without help. His body was a puzzle that never came together, and his mind, isolated, slow, unpredictable, was barely more stable than his spine. He was surrounded by whispers and priests. His caregivers were forbidden to discipline him. Instead, they prayed. When he cried, they chanted. When he lashed out in fits of rage or confusion, they blamed the devil. Some nights the royal chapel echoed with secret exorcisms. A boy, not yet 10, already an object of fear, not love. By the time Charles was in his 20s, his physical condition had only worsened. His jaw had grown so distorted that he could barely close it. He drooled constantly. He was described by ambassadors as grotesque in appearance and childlike in intellect. Yet the court insisted on finding him a wife. Not out of compassion, but desperation. The Habsburgs needed an heir. Charles needed a queen. And so the cycle turned once more. This time the chosen bride was Marie-Louise of Orléans, a French princess only 17 years old. She wept for days when she heard the news. Her father called it a living death sentence. Her mother advised her to obey God and endure. When she arrived in Madrid, she found a palace filled with silent priests and rot. Her husband was 35, deformed, sterile, and could barely speak her name. The marriage was a disaster from the first night. Charles could not consummate it. He tried, but his body, ravaged by congenital deformities and centuries of genetic collapse, refused to cooperate. Physicians were summoned. Religious relics were placed under the bed. Midwives and bishops debated whether the queen's virtue or the king's curse was to blame. No heir came. Only pain. Marie-Louise's life became a prison of ritual and humiliation. Every month her cycle was tracked, dissected, and prayed over. Every meal was scrutinized. Every expression was monitored. She fell into deep depression. She began refusing food. Her hair thinned. Her letters home turned frantic pleading. After 10 years of marriage, she died officially of indigestion, unofficially of despair. But Charles still needed a queen. The next bride was chosen quickly, Maria Anna of Neuburg, a German princess famed for her fertility. She had 11 siblings. The Spanish court hoped she could do what her predecessor could not. Instead, she arrived and found the same scene: a king barely capable of speech, physically repulsive, emotionally volatile, spiritually fragile. She detested him, but she did her duty. She lay beside him. She played the role. She bore no children. Charles became increasingly erratic. He suspected everyone of poisoning him. He performed bizarre rituals to lift curses. He demanded his father's body be exhumed so he could see if it had decayed. When they opened the tomb, he stared at the withered corpse and wept. He believed his family was cursed, that his sickness was not in his body but in his blood. He was right. Charles II was the final echo of a dynasty that had sealed its fate in flesh. He was born from a long line of child brides and uncle husbands. His body told a story that no priest or poet could hide. He was the last Spanish Habsburg, the end result of 100 years of incest dressed as tradition. His death was slow and public. He wasted away unable to eat his limbs like sticks, his skin yellowing like parchment. Court records from his final days are filled with terror he thought demons whispered to him. His breath stank of rot. His eyes became empty, and when he died in 1700, doctors performed an autopsy and wrote, "His heart was the size of a walnut, his lungs corroded, his intestines gangrenous, his head full of water, his body without blood. He died childless, alone, surrounded by priests and shadows." The last heir of a line that had traded love for legacy, sense for superstition, daughters for dynasty. And yet, in his death, Europe did not sigh with relief. It braced for war. Because Charles II had not just failed to produce an heir, he had torn open a vacuum of power. The consequences of one family's obsession with purity would now spiral into bloodshed across the continent. What happens when a dying king leaves behind nothing but his curse? The answer would come not in marriage halls but on battlefields. The moment Charles II was born, the midwives knew something was wrong. He did not cry. His eyes, though open, did not focus. His head lolled to one side and his tongue, grotesquely swollen, spilled from his mouth like a piece of dead flesh. His wet nurse had to feed him drop by drop, for he couldn't suckle. His muscles refused to obey him. He couldn't stand. He couldn't chew. And as he grew painfully slowly, it became clear the boy was not just slow. He was broken. They called him El Hechizado, the Bewitched. At first the court blamed witches, then demons, then fate. But behind closed doors, the physicians and apothecaries knew the truth. It was not magic that had hollowed out Spain's heir, it was incest. Charles II was the culmination of 2 centuries of Habsburg self-marriage. His family had twisted their family tree into a crown of thorns, and now it had punctured through the flesh. His parents were uncle and niece. His grandparents were double first cousins. The inbreeding coefficient of Charles's genome was a staggering 0.25 equivalent to the child of a brother and sister. His genes had no escape. They circled each other like rats in a sinking ship, breeding disease, deformity, and eventual collapse. From his infancy, Charles was a living tragedy. He suffered frequent seizures, could barely walk unassisted, and never truly learned to speak in complete sentences. His vocabulary remained stunted, his comprehension often absent. He laughed inappropriately at funerals, cried at sunlight, and sometimes forgot who he was. Despite this, his court continued to present him as monarch. But Charles wasn't ruling Spain, he was haunting it. Mariana of Austria, his mother and aunt, became the de facto ruler during his youth. But even she, raised in the same echo chamber of dynastic duty, began to suspect that something unnatural had occurred. She wrote to her confessor that Charles was not of this world and feared that he might be possessed. She increased the presence of priests in the palace. More exorcisms were performed. None of them worked. Charles continued to drool, babble, and stumble his way through royal life. At formal events, he had to be propped up by servants hidden behind curtains. At religious ceremonies, he fainted frequently. At banquets, he would vomit food he could not chew. Courtiers whispered that death followed him like a loyal servant. Foreign ambassadors described the court as a death march with powdered wigs. But still the Habsburgs pretended he could rule, pretended he could breed, pretended he was not the ghost of their own mistakes. He was made to marry twice. The first Marie Louise of Orleans loathed him. The second Maria Anna of Neuburg prayed he would die before she did. Neither could produce an heir. Neither could hide the truth. Charles was sterile not only in body but in legacy. His reign was a funeral procession disguised as a monarchy. But it wasn't just Charles who suffered. Spain suffered with him. Under his rule, the empire collapsed into inertia. Colonies decayed. Armies were neglected. The economy withered like a limb cut off from blood. Ministers competed for power behind his back, and court life devolved into superstition and silence. Disease swept the cities, famine gripped the countryside, and all the while the people waited for a sign, any sign that God had not abandoned them. They looked to their king, and what they saw terrified them. Charles began to speak of visions, of voices in the night. He claimed the dead whispered to him. He demanded his father's corpse be exhumed so he could see whether he had rotted proof he believed of a family curse. His advisors tried to stop him. He threatened excommunication. So they opened the tomb. The king knelt before the skeleton and wept. He had found what he needed, not comfort but confirmation. The rot was real. As he aged, Charles deteriorated further. His skin turned waxen. His legs gave out. He was blind in one eye. His body oozed sores that never healed. At court events he sat like a corpse propped up in silk. His speech was unintelligible, his breath foul, but no one dared end it, because his death would bring war. Behind the velvet curtains, Europe was already circling. France and Austria prepared for the inevitable. The Spanish throne had no heir, and when Charles died, the vultures would descend. So they waited and watched as a man who should never have lived slowly ceased to exist. In 1700, after years of slow-motion death, Charles finally passed. The court announced his death at midnight, his body still warm, his breath recently stopped. But in truth, Spain had died long before. The autopsy was the final horror. His body, the surgeons reported, was barely human. His heart the size of a walnut. His intestines putrefied and gangrenous. His head full of water. His testicles black as coal and shriveled. There was no blood in his veins. No life. Only a royal husk emptied by generations of sacred breeding. This was the end of the Spanish Habsburgs. But it was not the end of the consequences, because Charles had made a final act before his death. He named a successor, Philip of Anjou, a Bourbon prince and a grandson of the King of France. The blood of the Habsburgs would not continue, but Europe would not let that happen peacefully. What the Habsburgs had bred in shadows would now erupt in fire. What do you inherit from a dead king with no children? Only his war. He was the most dissected man in Europe, and he was still alive. Even before Charles II of Spain drew his final breath, his body had become a battlefield. Not one of swords and shields, but of scalpels, crucifixes, and leeches. His court physicians didn't heal, they experimented. His priests didn't comfort, they condemned. Charles existed at the crossroads of pre-modern medicine and medieval superstition, and every inch of his decaying body became territory to conquer, diagnose, exorcise, or simply survive. The royal doctors came first. They circled him like moths to a dying flame, scribbling symptoms, debating treatments, and arguing over bodily fluids like philosophers in a graveyard. When Charles suffered violent seizures, they called it melancholic imbalance. When he vomited blood, they blamed excessive heat of the liver. The remedies were worse than the diseases. They drained his blood until he fainted. They blistered his skin with hot irons to draw out toxins. They forced potions down his throat made from liquefied earthworms, human skull powder, and feces dissolved in wine. And none of it worked. In fact, Charles got worse with every treatment. He grew skeletal, weak, and delirious. At times, his legs refused to move. His tongue would swell so violently that he could not eat or speak. His teeth blackened, his hair thinned. He wailed like an infant in the night. The palace reeked of bile incense and rotting skin. So, when medicine failed, the priests took over. They said the king was bewitched, that some jealous court faction, or perhaps the devil himself, had cast a shadow over Charles's soul. His impotence, a hex. His seizures, possession. His infertility, punishment for sins his or someone else's. The church held secret masses. They brought in relics, bones of saints' thorns from Christ's crown crosses that had healed plague victims centuries ago. But Charles still withered. So they escalated. They conducted full exorcisms. Full. Imagine it, the King of Spain clad in silk robes curled in bed, while a priest in black shouted Latin incantations and flung holy water onto his twitching, fevered body. Candles flickered against the sweating walls as demons were named, spirits banished, sins catalogued. Sometimes Charles screamed. Other times he laughed. Not because it was funny, but because his mind was slipping, peeling away like old paint from a dying wall. Witnesses later recalled that the palace felt less like a royal court and more like an asylum for the possessed. Even his wife Maria Anna of Neuburg believed he was damned. She called for her own confessors. She kept blessed salt in her rooms and wore holy metals sewn into her corsets. She claimed something dark moved in the halls at night, something not of this world. Charles believed it too. He began to speak of curses passed down through blood. He blamed dead relatives, his father, his mother, even his grandmother, for his torment. He suspected his stepbrothers of black magic. He once refused to eat for days, believing his meals were cursed by witches. The king of one of the most powerful nations on earth had become a shell, a puppet trembling before shadows. And still the court watched. They recorded it. They made plans. Because Charles wasn't just a monarch, he was a time bomb. And when he died, the illusion of Spanish stability would die with him. So the doctors continued to prod, and the priests continued to chant, and the European envoys began to position their pawns. France, Austria, England all awaited the moment when the bewitched king's lungs would finally stop. When that day came, November 1st, 1700, there was no peace, only bureaucracy. The royal physician made the announcement with the solemnity of a man unveiling a disaster. The king was dead. The king who had never truly ruled. The king who had been ruled by blood, by fear, by sickness, by religion. Then came the final act, the autopsy. It was not a scientific procedure. It was a confession written in flesh. The surgeons laid Charles open like a crime scene. What they found was not just horrifying, it was damning. His body was so malformed, so thoroughly corrupted that it defied explanation. His heart, they said, was the size of a dried walnut. His intestines were gangrenous. His lungs were corroded and full of pus. His head was filled with water, indicating severe hydrocephalus. His testicles were black, withered, and calcified. Most disturbing of all, there was no blood in his body. A phrase that in the language of the time meant his corpse had already turned to stone before the soul had fully left it. Even the priests could no longer call it witchcraft. This was not a curse, this was consequence. A consequence of a system that fed daughters to their uncles, that refused to let fresh blood dilute sacred rot. That called deformity divine. That married girls, too young to understand the words "till death do us part" to men, old enough to be their grandfathers and their kin. Charles II had been treated like a beast in a lab, a doll for prayers, a symbol for God's judgment. But he was none of those things. He was a boy born into a grave. And when they buried him, they buried not just a king, but a lineage. The last of the Spanish Habsburgs, the final result of centuries of inbreeding passed off as divine strategy. But what of the brides who shared his fate? They still lived. They still wore crowns. And they could not escape. They were queens. But they lived like phantoms. Silken gowns, gilded chapels, servants at every whim. These were the tools of their imprisonment, not luxuries. The queens of the House of Habsburg bore crowns forged from obligation, silence, and unbearable loneliness. They were born noble, trained to please, and offered as sacrifice. And once married, they were locked into a palace of whispers where no one listened and no one dared speak of the truth. One of them was Mariana of Austria, both niece and wife to King Philip IV, and later the mother and aunt of Charles II. She was married at just 15. Her husband was 30 years her senior and already decaying. Gout twisted his feet. Gluttony bloated his belly. His breath stank of rotting teeth and spoiled wine. She had never known freedom before him. She would never know it after. The marriage bed was cold and ceremonial. Their duty was not companionship, it was reproduction. Within weeks of arrival, Mariana was under pressure to produce an heir. When she didn't conceive, immediately courtiers whispered of witchcraft barrenness sin. Priests laid relics in her sheets. Midwives fed her charred lizard tails mixed with saffron. Her husband, already suspicious and slow-moving, began to accuse her of conspiracy. She miscarried. And then again. The few children she birthed died in infancy, one after the other, each one born more twisted than the last. One daughter had a fused spine and died gasping hours after birth. Another was born with eyes that never opened. Finally, she gave birth to Charles II. She should have celebrated. Instead, she wept. He was the only one to survive. But his survival was a curse, not a blessing. As Charles's condition worsened, Mariana's role shifted from mother to manager. She became queen regent when her husband died overseeing Spain on behalf of her son, a monarch in name only. The court was vicious. Ministers schemed, cardinals whispered, and Mariana was surrounded by enemies in every direction. But it was Charles who consumed her life. She watched him falter, writhe, drool. She watched doctors bleed him dry and priests scream Latin over his foaming mouth. And she never left his side. Letters from her later years show a woman breaking in slow motion. She begged Rome for more relics. She prayed through the night. She fasted until she fainted. One letter to her confessor contains a single chilling line. If he is cursed, then so am I. But she was not alone in her suffering. There was Margaret Theresa, married to her uncle Leopold, Holy Roman Emperor. She was sent from Spain to Vienna at age 15, a bright and curious girl with a sweet smile and golden hair. By the time she arrived, Leopold was 30, gaunt, pious, emotionally distant. Their marriage was marked by frequent pregnancies and even more frequent funerals. Margaret gave birth to 4 children. Only one lived past infancy. She died at age 21, her body wasted by miscarriage, infection, and melancholy. She was painted again and again by Spanish artists before her departure. In every portrait, she grows smaller. In one, she stands with a hand on a table, stiff, solemn, the weight of a nation already pulling at her shoulders. Then there was Maria Anna of Neuburg, the final wife of Charles II. She came from a German house infamous for fertility, 11 siblings, all strong. Spain hoped she would save the dynasty. Instead, she found herself trapped in a dying empire beside a man barely human. Charles's body revolted at her presence. He could not consummate the marriage. He blamed her for his weakness. The court turned on her. She wrote letters to her family in Germany, frantic and despairing. In one, she said, "I live in a tomb with a corpse for a husband and devils in the walls." In another, "I fear the king is not alive." "I fear I am not either." She tried to flee when she was stopped. The Spanish court could not risk scandal. She was too valuable, too symbolic. So she stayed and watched him die. Even outside Spain, Habsburg queens suffered similar fates. Catherine of Austria, Joanna of Castile, Elizabeth of Valois, all pawns in the game of breeding purity. Most of them went mad, died young, or disappeared into early graves. Their lives were tragedies veiled in lace. Their smiles were painted on. Their eyes in every portrait hold the same expression. How do you scream in a world that calls your silence holy, and yet the world watched them, applauded their weddings, praised their piety, called their endurance heroic? They were not heroes, they were inmates. What is a queen when her body belongs to a bloodline, her voice to a crown, her pain to no one? These women were not victims of passion. They were processed, groomed, married, and destroyed by a dynasty that saw them not as daughters, sisters, or wives, but as carriers. They carried the blood, they carried the curse, and they carried the silence. But how does a family keep marrying itself for centuries and still believe it is chosen by God to answer that we must turn not to the queens, but to the priests who blessed every step toward damnation? In the flickering candlelight of the royal chapel, incense thick in the air and gold gleaming from every corner, a king would slip a ring onto his niece's finger. Behind them, a bishop in full regalia smiled. Before them, a crucifix loomed. And somewhere behind the veil of ritual and righteousness, God remained silent. The Habsburgs believed in divine right not as metaphor, but as mandate. Their blood was sacred, their power heaven-sanctioned. Every war they waged, every decree they signed, and every incestuous marriage they arranged was done under the watchful eyes of angels. Or so they believed. And so when the children born of these unions began to decay in the womb, when their kings turned into malformed shadows, they didn't blame themselves, they blamed sin, Satan, God's anger. But they never questioned the root. They never asked if God had truly ordained these horrors or if perhaps he had turned his face away. The Catholic Church had long upheld the sacredness of royal unions, even those that defied nature. Dispensations were granted like candy. Marrying a cousin easy? An uncle permissible if the political gain justified it. By the 16th century, papal approval had become a formality, rubber-stamped endorsements for marriages that should have never left a confession booth. The theology was twisted into knots. Blood purity was associated with divine favor. The closer the genetic bond, the stronger the spiritual connection, or so it was argued. In this warped cosmology, deformities weren't consequences of incest. They were tests of faith. And women who suffered through miscarriages, stillbirths, and madness were praised for their holiness. Pain was sanctified. Silence was glorified. And as for the kings, they were not just rulers, they were instruments of God. Even Charles II, twitching and drooling through Mass, was treated as divine flesh. His suffering only enhanced the illusion. Here was a Christ-like king, carrying the cross of his nation in his twisted bones. The more grotesque he became, the more fervent the rituals. Every failure of his body was met not with scientific inquiry, but with superstition relics and desperate prayers. One Jesuit priest declared him an angel cursed to walk in flesh too impure for his soul. In truth, Charles was neither angel nor curse. He was a victim, a breathing condemnation of centuries of theology misused as political armor. As Spain deteriorated around him, economically, militarily, socially, the Church continued to offer comfort without answers. Sermons blamed sin and foreign corruption, but never the crown, never the incest, never the empire's own hubris. They told the starving peasants to pray harder. They told the grieving queens to confess more. They told Charles to keep believing that his tongue, too swollen to speak, was not a sign of failure, but divine mystery. It would be easy to think the priests were blind, but they weren't. They saw the decay, they touched it, they anointed it, and still they blessed the next wedding. Still they told the next child bride to obey, because the machine was bigger than any one soul, and it needed fuel. The rituals were relentless. Weddings between niece and uncle were carried out in chapels echoing with hymns. Brides were draped in Marian blue made to resemble the Virgin Mother, as if innocence could be weaponized. Grooms recited vows while clutching rosaries, and all of it, every prayer, every chant, every organ pipe's cry, was built on the backs of children sacrificed to a throne. When things went wrong, and they always did, blame was passed like communion wine. Maybe the queen had sinned, maybe her womb was cursed, maybe the court had failed to please God with sufficient piety. Never once did they turn to the grotesque genealogy of the Habsburgs and ask the unthinkable, what if this isn't sacred? What if this is madness masquerading as holiness? Because to admit that was to unravel the entire fabric of their power. To admit that was to confess they had turned faith into a weapon, a ritualized justification for breeding their own daughters into extinction. That they had twisted scripture to fit their needs. That they had made a golden calf out of their own blood. And yet, some did begin to whisper. By the late 1600s, scholars and physicians outside the court began to question the old doctrines. The Enlightenment loomed on the horizon, and with it came ideas too dangerous to speak aloud in Madrid or Vienna. Science began to suggest that heredity mattered, that repeated intermarriage could deform not just bodies but minds, that perhaps it wasn't Satan at work but man. But it was too late. Charles was dying. Spain was collapsing. The priests still chanted. The incense still burned. But the silence of God had become unbearable. The line was ending. The last Habsburg king would not rise again. The empire had been built on sacred blood. That blood had curdled, and still they called it holy. But when the crown finally slips from a cursed skull, what comes next? Not peace, not healing, but war. When Charles II died in 1700, the Spanish royal bed was empty. The heirless corpse was embalmed. The crown, still heavy with divine pretense, had no head to rest upon. But his death did not bring peace. It tore Europe apart. He left behind no children, no successors of his blood, only a will naming Philip of Anjou a French Bourbon and grandson of Louis XIV as his heir. In doing so, Charles II not only extinguished the Spanish Habsburgs, but handed their empire to their rivals. And Europe, already sickened by generations of Habsburg incest and arrogance, saw opportunity in the void. The War of the Spanish Succession began almost immediately. 9 years of carnage across continents. Thousands dead. Entire regions burned. Not because of ambition, but because of legacy. Because one boy had been born of blood too thick, too sacred, and too ruined to carry forward. The empire he left behind was rotted at its roots. Spain, once the center of the world, became a shell. The colonies slipped away. The silver stopped flowing. And the palaces once filled with children born to queens and uncles echoed with nothing but silence and the scratch of rats. The Habsburg name still held weight in Austria, but it was never again what it had been in Spain. The jaw remained. The madness lingered. But the myth had died with Charles. And yet the legacy of that incestuous dynasty, its ideologies, its poison, didn't end in a tomb. It lived on in quieter ways. In 19th century eugenics movements that cited pure bloodlines as ideals. In royal houses that continued to marry cousins into the 20th century. In pseudoscientific theories about race purity and inheritance that would one day be weaponized on a far more horrific scale. The Habsburgs gave the world a blueprint for noble collapse. Believe yourself sacred. Ignore the suffering beneath your crown and cloak abuse in religion. Marry your blood until it turns to poison. Smile while your daughters become sacrifices. And always, always pretend it is God's will. But the final image is not divine. It is a child bride trembling beside her Uncle King eyes, hollowed out by fear and silk. It is a malformed heir screaming in a golden cradle. It is a mother pressing her forehead to her sons, knowing that he was born not of love but of obligation. It is a jawbone buried in royal marble still grinning. They thought they were gods. But gods do not rot. Only men do. And in the house of Habsburg they rotted together. If this haunting journey through royal decay kept you on the edge of your seat, don't forget to like the video, share it with someone who thinks history is boring. They won't. After this, and subscribe for more stories that peel back the velvet curtain of power to show the rot beneath. Drop a comment. Which moment chilled you the most? The child bride, the exorcised king, the jaw that became a curse? We've only scratched the surface. Welcome to Dark History. And remember, the past doesn't sleep. It festers. Until next time.